Hello, children. I'm Mrs. Neha Bhargavi, a social science teacher of Mount Zion Metric Higher Secondary School, Pudukottai. In this video, I'm going to teach you a chapter 4 in history of class 8. Let's go to the lesson. In this video, we are going to see about the topic colonialism and tribal society in chapter 4 of history. From this lesson, you will be able to know the changes within the tribal economies and societies in the 19th century, how the government records can be read against the grain to reconstruct histories of tribal revolts. In this chapter, we will learn about the impact of colonial rule on the tribal communities. The tribe society, who is called as the tribe peoples, they are some of the oldest people of the land. India is a home to fairly large tribal populations. The tribe communities of India have many beliefs, customs, and traditions. Most of these involve the worship of nature. The rest of the society should learn from them and develop the same respect of nature. And the oldest people of the land are hence known as the Adivasis, literally meaning original inhabitants. We learned about the different tribal groups of India. And next, sources. How can we get the details of these tribal peoples? We can get the history of the tribal communities of India in the colonial period can be reconstructed from many sources. Important are government records such as the acts, laws, police records, and the memoirs of government officials, and newspaper reports, and also provide a lot of information on the events and incidents of the period. An important source of history of this period is the oral records passed down and preserved across generations. These consist of myths, war songs, and the poems of liberation composed by the Adivasis. These oral sources are compiled and studied by the scholar known as the anthropologist. A person who studied the science, he was called as a scientist. Similarly, the oral sources are compiled and studied by the scholars are known as the anthropologist. And next, the tribal society under the British control. Traditionally, in tribe societies, a particular place of land used to be given to the families by the village council or the village chief. In hill areas, particularly where the shifting agriculture was practiced, there was no concept of personal ownership of the land and there were no written records of the ownership of the land. There was no land revenues and no written records, and to be paid, there was no need for them to have the written proof of ownership of the land. So, however, the coming of the British disturbed the largely self sufficient community of the tribal people. As a result of the new revenue policies of the British, the regions that traditionally belonged to the tribal groups came under the colonial administration during the second half of the 18th century. They did so by resorting to heavy taxation, deforestation, and the land appropriation. The tribal people had no written record of the ownership of the land and took away their lands. The land was given to the zamindars, who were usually outsiders based in the cities. The tribal people began to increasingly resent the entry of the outsiders. The dikers, in the local language, they were called as dikers, like the forest contractors, officials, and the traders and the money lenders into the land. The tribes were forced to work on the agricultural and the land under the new zamindars and pay high revenues. To pay the revenue, they often borrowed money from the money lenders at the high rates of interest. The tribal people began to increasingly resent the entry outsiders, like called as the dikers in the local language, like the forest contractors. officials, traders, and the money lenders into their land. The British also made the several attempts to autonomize the tribal people through their activities in the tribal regions. Many tribal groups were gradually made to abandon their traditional culture and the religious beliefs and embrace the Western ideas and their practices. And the next topic, tribal revolts. The exploitative practices of the British led to a number of rebellions in the various tribal regions of India. In the tribal revolts, the exploitative practices of the British led to a number of rebellions in the various tribal regions of India. Some of the important rebellions in the list, the Chowar in 1768 and Malbaharia people in 1772, the Kol 1831 to 1833 and the Kond 1846 to 1914 and the Santhal rebellion 1855 and the Munda 1885 and the Orion 1914. So these are the peoples who were called as the important rebellions in the British period. The Santhal rebellion and um, similarly another one important rebellion was the Santhal rebellion. The Santhal rebellion people were a dominant tribal community occupying the large tracts of land in present day Jharkhand. They lost their land to the British and became obliged to pay the heavy taxes, harass and exploit them. The increasing press of missionaries in the Santhal region, the construction of railway lines that seemed to threaten the traditional way of life. So it was added to the discontent of the Santhal people. So the Tilka Manji was among the first of the Santals to rise and revolt against the British in the 18th century. He formed a liberation of the group with the Paharia people but was executed shortly after. In June 1855, the Santal people against rose in revolt against their oppressors. Over 10,000 Santals armed the armed with bows, arrows, and spears, assembled in the village of the Bhaganadi in attacked and executed many zamindars, money lenders, traders, police, and the revenue officials. The revolt was eventually crushed and the leaders captured the killed. The British passed the act that was called as the Santhal Paragnas Tenancy Act that aimed of protecting the Santhal people from exploitation. They succeeded in recapturing large tracts of land extending from the Bhagalpur to Birbhum in current today in West Bengal. Okay, so next, the another group of rebellion called Munda Algulan. It, it was also one of the most important rebellion groups in the tribals under control by the British peoples. The Munda people were a prominent tribal group of the Bihar, Jharkhand region and functioned as a Kankati Das. The Munda were compelled to pay the rent to the zamindars, failing in which they were evicted from their land and made to work as bonded laborers. The system was known as the bet began or forced laborer. That means the bonded laborers. They have to sign with the zamindars, so they were called as a forced laborers. They were bonded laborers. This system was known as the bet began system. On the late 19th century, Birsa Munda, he was a young tribal leader who boldly challenged the rule and activities of the British. Birsa Munda was deeply influenced by the Munda tribal chief arms or Sardars. He looked upon a godly figure with a divine power. He worshipped as a god. Birsa led a series of rebellions against the British in 1890s, launched a guerrilla attacks on the British people. Under the Birsa leadership, more and more people joined the rebellion Algulan. They openly defied the British authorities, stopped paying and killed zamindars, missionaries, and officials. Birsa was jailed in 1900, where he subsequently died. As a result of the rebellion, the Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1908 was passed, which resorted the ownership of the land to the Mundas and abolished the Beth Begari. So, some of the acts were passed by the British. The important acts were the British laws and their effects on the tribal groups. The Permanent Settlement Act of 1793 exposed the tribal community to the greed of the money lenders and zamindars. The British isolated the tribal communities from the non-tribal communities by the Government of India Act of 1835. The Criminal Tribes Act was passed in 1871, which classified a number of tribal groups as a criminal. As a result of this act, the British constantly monitored and punished a vast number of tribal groups. So, let's recap this session. Let's recap this lesson, children. What we have learned from this lesson: the changes within the tribal economies and the societies in the 19th century, the tribal revolts, Santhal rebellion, the Munda Alkulan. We are learnt about the most important tribal peoples under control by the British. The governments. What are the sources? The government records can be read against the grain to reconstruct the histories of the tribal revolts, the causes and the course of the tribal revolts in the Chota Nagpur region. Thank you, children. We will continue the part B of this lesson. Thank you.